I want you to turn to Philippians chapter 2, and I want to read for our lesson this morning. Let's start with verse 12. I want to read down through verse 18. Philippians 2, verses 12 through 18. Therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to accomplish or to act according to His good purpose. Do everything without complaining or arguing, so that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe, as you hold forth the word of light, in order that I may boast on the day of Christ that I did not run or labor for nothing. But even if I am being poured out like a drink offering on the sacrifice and service coming from your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with all of you, so you too should be glad and rejoice with me. This morning we're going to be looking at the mind of Christ in action. The next Sunday and the following Sunday, we'll have a two-part series on the mind of Christ. Here we're looking at the mind of Christ in action. Paul is going to talk about that mind of Christ holds forth the word of life. It rejoices in the day of Christ, recognizes that it has not run in vain, and that it has not labored in vain. So let's begin with, Paul says that this life, this mind of Christ in action, holds forth the word of life. And all week as I was thinking this, I couldn't get out of my mind the picture of the Statue of Liberty, holding forth light, gathering those who need direction, and we as Christians hold forth, like Paul, the word of life, giving direction, guiding those who need that in their life. For Paul, this is a mutual working of salvation with God. The reason I say that, as I started reading this off, and we sort of did this in Sunday morning Bible class with a verse. Therefore, this is verse 12, therefore, my dear friends, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. What if I stop there? You need to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. We'll dismiss you today so you can go do that. That's not where it ends. Look at what Paul adds to that. For it is God who works in you to will and to act according to His good purpose. When we take our salvation seriously, it's not 100% effort, pulling myself up by my bootstraps, making sure I'm perfect so I can go to heaven. That's not at all what Paul says. When I take my salvation seriously, it is recognizing God working in me. You recognizing God working in you to bring about His purposes. When you catch a hold of that, and that it is based on a life of grace, lived in gratitude for the gift of salvation, it changes everything about your faith. It is amazing, because when we hold forth the word of life, we recognize God gives us the strength, the opportunity, the courage to do that for others. And Paul moves from preaching to meddling. You ever heard that expression? He's quit preaching, now he's meddling. Paul does a lot of that. Do everything without grumbling and arguing against one another. Really? I can't grumble about you? I can't argue with you or complain? Oh, he's taking all the fun out of life. But really, think about it. When we put the mind of Christ in action, It is first and foremost concerned in how it relates to other Christians. See, if I spend all of my time complaining about you, and not just to you, but to others, I have negated the mind of Christ. It's just not there. If I argue and I'm argumentative and I want to make my point, I want to make you see my point, and all the ugliness that can get going when all that gets going, that's not the mind of Christ. See, Paul understands that if I claim that I have the mind of Christ, the first place you're going to see it is how I treat other people. Because see, I really appreciated David sharing with us how that prayer from Daniel helps inform his prayer life. I'm going to go back and look at that. Thank you, David. But we can't always see our personal, individual journeys with God. Sometimes we don't know what that looks like in each of us. We know what it looks like when we assemble together, but not privately. But when it comes to the second commandment, as Jesus calls it, the mind of Christ in action, first and foremost, is how I interact with you. And we need to hear that. I think sometimes it's easy to forget that. This is a challenge, holding forth the word of life. Okay, then he says, this is the purpose so that you can be blameless and pure. And he has a direct reason for saying that. It doesn't mean I'm perfect, but it comes out of Deuteronomy 32:5 and this Old Testament background. When sacrifices were offered to God, you didn't just grab something out of the ditch and offer it. You gave your best to God. When we take on the mind of Christ in action, we do our best to let Christ shine through us in what we say and how we act. In fact, Paul's going to use a fascinating illustration here. It's like the stars shining in the sky. And I thought about that. We have so much light out at nighttime. It's hard for us to appreciate unless you can get out in the country and you see the stars really crystal clear. Well, in Paul's day, you probably could see crystal clear the stars in the sky at night. And this is a wonderful image that how we live is an example for those living in darkness. And when Paul says, I want you to hold forth that word of light, it carries the notion of paying special attention to it. Holding forth, knowing the value of what you've got. I remember watching a movie recently. One little girl was holding forth a cone of ice cream, sort of tentatively going to give it to her sister. Wasn't quite sure if that's what she wanted to do, and the whole thing fell out of her hand, plop on the sidewalk. If you don't pay special attention to what you're holding forth, you can lose it. And Paul knows this. But it is the word of life. Christ embodies both of them. The Word. Christ is the living Word. Christ is the risen life. And when you and I try to embrace what is called the incarnational life, we want to see Jesus in us. We want other people to see Jesus in us. What do? We're living the Word because of Jesus. We're living the life because of Jesus. It goes back to Him. What a beautiful imagery of holding forth the word of life. But it rejoices in the day of Christ. This refers to His coming and His return. In Philippians 1:6 and 1:10, the day of Christ is important for Paul in his letter to the Philippians. He anticipates that every single day. When I read the letters of Paul, I get the impression that he lived intentionally and focused on every day the knowledge that his Lord was coming back again. That needs to be raised in our awareness. Every single day we know could be our last one. Every single day that we live could be the one that Christ returns. We live with that intense kind of focus because He will keep you firm to the end so that you will be blameless on the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 1:8. Notice he can keep us firm to the end. Why is that? Because we're blameless because of his righteousness, what God has done for us in Christ. All through Paul's letters, he will say over and over and over again, here's what Christ has done for me. Not based on my righteousness, but his righteousness that is credited to my account. And in Philippians 4, verse 4, this is a rejoicing that is tied to the day of Christ. When I read Paul, I can't find anything that makes him rejoice any more than the anticipation and what he thinks it's going to be like when Christ returns. Ultimate rejoicing. Not ultimate fear, ultimate rejoicing. The other day, we watched the old black and, if you've never seen it, I would encourage you to see it, the old black and white movie, Pollyanna. It's an old movie. In that scene is the preacher on Sunday preaching an old-fashioned sermon of hellfire and brimstone. And the matriarch of the church said, before that Sunday, I want you to preach the wrath of God so that they'll carry it with them through the rest of the week and they'll be ready to hear it again the next Sunday. Well, is that holding forth the word of life? Is that what the good news is all about? If I anticipate with ultimate fear the return of my Lord, something has gone wrong. Something's gone wrong. For Paul, it's ultimate rejoicing. Nothing's any higher, nothing's any greater than anticipating that return. Paul says, having this mind of Christ in action recognizes it has not run in vain. I remember being aware of the story of someone involved in the Ironman contest, and there are different ways that that's carried about, but you have running and swimming and cycling and that sort of thing. But for an Ironman to discover, he ran the wrong part of the course, and he ran in vain. Oh man, mile after mile, running the wrong direction. And we hate to do things in vain or for nothing. Have you had someone come up and say to you, you know you did that for nothing? All the way of maybe from painting the walls of a room and someone come up to you and say, you did that for nothing because we were going to wallpaper that anyway. You've had your list of things. You know what it's like to do something for nothing. You're like, oh, and you feel like you wasted your time and your effort. I could have been doing something else. And we know what that's about. But Paul uses this athletic metaphor because it implies that the race has a reward in the end, and you haven't run in vain. 1 Corinthians 9:24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. In Galatians chapter 2 and verse 2, I went in response to a revelation, and meeting privately with those esteemed as leaders, I presented to them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. I wanted to be sure. I'm going to come back and underline. I wanted to be sure I was not running and had not been running my race in vain. I think we all want to be sure that our Christian life is not being lived in vain, don't we? What is that guarantee? It's a continual reliance on the work of God within us, holding forth the word of life, knowing that the risen Christ is the gift of God for us. He gives us the path, we follow him. Galatians 5:7. This is interesting. You were running a good race. Who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? Have you ever seen runners racing around a track and somebody cuts in on somebody else? Not very nice. The Judaizing teachers did that to the Christians in Galatia. Who is that for us? What is it that cuts in on us as we're running the Christian race? What is it that interferes with our life as a Christian? That's such an important question, because listen to Hebrews 12 and verse 1. The writer says, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Look at that scripture. Throw off everything that hinders. And for each one of us, different things hinder us in our life as a Christian, trying to keep the mind of Christ in action. And we know what that is. Ongoing struggle, and it so easily entangles us. I was reading the autobiography of a minister this past week, where he talked about how that things that he struggled with when he was growing up, because he didn't deal with them, showed up again in his adult life and impacted his ministry. Really, really insightful. And so if we're not careful, when we don't deal with the very things that cut in on our race, temptations we've given into, sins that we've committed, people that we've hurt, and we can just continue with the list. When we don't deal with those when we should, they kind of stay in the background, and then they crop up at times when we don't want them to. And they destroy our ministry, and they destroy our witness. Paul says also that the mind of Christ in action recognizes it has not labored in vain. Paul uses the word labor to describe his work in the gospel. And as I was thinking about that, that word labor comes out for Paul in 5 different metaphors. And I'll just mention, we don't have time to explore them this morning, but you'll be aware of them. The first is evangelist. He labors by sharing good news. The second one is a father. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I'm your father in the faith. The third one is nurse. Just like a nurse takes care of a child, I have nursed you in your fledgling Christian journey. Number 4 is a teacher. Paul saw himself instructing Christians, new Christians, as to the way of Christ. And then number 5, mentor. He doesn't use the word mentor, he uses the word imitation. Imitate me as I also imitate Christ. Quite a claim, isn't it? That each one of us needs to see ourselves providing a model for others to follow. So Paul, having this mind of Christ in action, recognizes that it has not been labor in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. We need to hear that again. Let nothing move you. Believe me, a lot of things can try. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, not just dabbling in it. I read recently someone describing the Christian life, dabbling in the Lord. What a great phrase. We're not dabbling in it. We're giving ourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain. 2 Corinthians 6:1. As God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. As God's co-workers. I hear a lot of people complaining about their co-workers. Well, God is a co-worker we can work with. We don't have complaints. We're on the same side together. We're working hard together. And Paul wants us not to receive God's grace in vain. 1 Thessalonians 3:5. For this reason, when I could stand it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith, because I was afraid. And listen to Paul. He's telling us his heart. I was afraid that in some way the tempter had tempted you, and that our labors might have been in vain. We all know others in their spiritual journey that we're afraid that somehow the tempter has tempted them. We need to pray for one another that the tempter doesn't do that. That's part of our holding forth the word of life. Being deeply concerned about where people are. Deeply concerned they don't give in to the temptations of the tempter. So we're encouraged by the mind of Christ in action. It holds forth the word of life. That kind of life also rejoices in anticipation of the day of Christ. He's coming back. Recognizes it has not run in vain, and recognizes it's a work, it's a life where it hasn't labored in vain. This morning, and because of what Ray did, it reminded me, we have sort of started a new tradition, in addition to the other one of saying hi to Catherine and others online. Wanted to remind you that the elders and their wives, ministers and their wives, and anyone else that wants to stand around and be prepared to have someone respond to the good news, we want you to be aware of that opportunity this morning. It may be, as you look at your life, you could say that you have not had the mind of Christ in action, that you've been lacking in many ways. And as you look at your life with God, you're not satisfied. There's this inner angst, and you realize things aren't right. Well, if we can help you with that this morning in any way, maybe you haven't given your life to Christ, come to the cross, and made a baptismal commitment to arise with that new life, connected with Christ as you arise. Maybe you've not done that. But if there's a way in which we can help you with the mind of Christ in action, holding forth the word of life, won't you respond while we stand and sing?